This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. You know, we've been around for a long time now, and we've had many different lineups, and Heretic Happy Hour is only getting bigger and better with guest hosts like Rainn Wilson, David Bentley Hart, John Fugelsang, Candida Moss, Elaine Pagels, and of course, December Rose. 2024 and 2025 are turning out to be our best years yet. So check us out on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's Heretic Happy Hour. We hope to see you soon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
G'day, mate. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat, and I'm here with me brother. I just went from Australian to East End. I went from g'day to brother. I like that. I like that accent a lot, though. I like that everything becomes a V, right? Hello, this is my brother over here. By the way, this is the podcast that you have just. Wait a minute, maybe no. Don't turn it off yet. Hang on, hold up. It gets better. I promise. Let me fumble through the introductions, and I promise you it will improve when both Bethany and John start talking, and our guest, of course. But hey, this is not church, because if this was church, you would have left by now. You might not even made it past this introduction. Anyway. Here we are with our co-host, my brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And our other co-host, Bethany. Hey, what's up, Bethany? Say hi.
Hi, everybody.
You thought I was going to say more than that. I said say hi, and
I
just
like,
sort of
wait. What do I say? There's a pause. What do we do with the pause?
This is such an amateur hour shit show. What is going on here? We're here to talk about serious things today. And the guy introducing everyone can hardly form a sentence, but that's okay. I'm actually practicing because I'm thinking of running for president in 2028. And
there we go.
It seems like the more incoherent you are, it seems like you do well, at least amongst certain demographics. So anyway, as always, we have an awesome guest with us today who actually needs no introduction. This is, the third or fourth time we've had Thomas Jay Oord on the podcast. If you don't know who Thomas is, well, get out from under your rock, because Tom is the man. He's a best-selling author of many, many really amazing books. We're here to talk about his latest book called God After Deconstruction. But if you haven't picked up his other books like God Can't and The Uncontrolled Love of God, I mean, this is a guy who, for me, and I'm blowing smoke before we even start, Tom. You sit for me, and I know this means the world to you, so I'll say this. But you sit in this sort of pantheon of like 4 or 5 really, really modern contemporary thinkers who have like saved my faith.
Oh my!
Like, you've given me something to when I was ready to like pitch the whole damn thing. I'm like, well, wait a second, this guy's making a lot of sense. I think there's something here I can hold on to, a life raft of sorts. And so for that, thank you. I think it's meant an awful lot, and your, just the way you've taken head on some of these issues at your own peril, in some ways. And we'll talk about that somewhat as well. But before we get started, I just wanted to say that to you because you've meant an awful lot to me. Your writing has meant an awful lot to me. And I know I'm not alone. I know there's a lot more. So welcome back to the podcast, Mr. Thomas Oord.
Thanks for that. It's always good to chat with you guys. That's very, very kind. I'm honored that you'd say that.
I meant every word, and the invoice is incoming. So I do it. No, but you just came back from a little European tour. What was that all about?
Yeah. Well, I was speaking mostly in England. I had a conference at the beginning of August, and then I spoke at Greenbelt around the 20th. And I decided instead of flying back to the States and dealing with jet lag twice, I'd stay and put together a little schedule of speaking engagements. Shout out to Simon Cross of Progressive Christianity, who did a lot of the scheduling. But I had a great time. I mean, I got tired of living out of a backpack and doing my laundry in hotel sinks. But, other than that, I had a good time.
Yeah, well, it's good, man. So let's broach the topic of the new book, because I thought, and I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. Just to be honest with you, I have skimmed it, I have perused it, but in the in this space where it seems like everyone's writing a book about deconstruction, I thought your take on it was pretty fresh. But then again, your take on most things is pretty fresh. So maybe just, it really is. Walk us through. One thing I really love about your books, and you do this in all of your books, it seems like, is you find narratives. And so there's, the book opens with a story. And that grabs me because who doesn't love a good story? And it helps us make connections. But walk us through that process of maybe the need to write this book about what happens after deconstruction?
Yeah, we're doing several things in this book, and one of them is bringing together the surveys that we and others have done of people who talk about deconstructing in one sense or another, and kind of collecting all of this information and asking the question, what are the primary reasons people are walking away from faith, walking away from church, walking away from God, however they want to articulate it? What are the big reasons? And so, in looking at all the literature, seeing the discussions, we identify 8 legitimate reasons people are leaving the faith. And then we're not just sort of being descriptive. We're also offering a different way of thinking about God, life, church, etc., that we call open and relational theology. So I think the book is unique in that way, in at least those 2 ways.
I'm curious, like how often you see people from the stories that you've been able to gather. How often do people eventually come back to a church setting, or do they create new, different textures of faith in their lives? Or what does that look like? Or what has that looked like?
Yeah, well, first I should say just a few statistics at everybody here, because to sort of set the stage for my answer to that, Bethany. In 2016 it was, 16% of Americans checked the box that said none, N-O-N-E, for their religious affiliation. They had no religious affiliation. Earlier this year in 2024, 26% checked that same box. That's a jump of about 40 million Americans who now no longer identify with a religion. But what's intriguing about that is that of those people who check the no religious affiliation box, the none box, like 80% of them still believe in a higher power, God, something like that. So a lot of these people aren't going to church, aren't affiliated with a religious institution, but they still believe there's something more, something transcendent. And we're finding that a lot of the folks who have those kind of beliefs are not finding it easy to find other people who think similarly. They're not joining religious oriented groups of some kind or another. It used to be the sociologists would say, well, all these teenagers, 20 somethings, they're leaving church. They'll come back in their 30s because they'll have kids and they'll want their kids to have a moral compass, and the church provides that. But those people are not coming back. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. But I think this is the biggest question for many of us is, what is the future of affiliation for those people who have some sense of God or spirituality or whatever?
That's a tough one, because, that for me, what has eroded a lot of my faith in church as an institution is that absolute failure of a moral compass. I mean, I don't feel like the church has a moral compass anymore. They've traded like an authentic morality for a very superficial, like, code keeping. And so they're very interested in keeping out those they deem as undesirable, but really happy as hell to jump on the side of Christian nationalists and to cheer violence and war when it suits their purposes. And I'm like, that's the moral compass I'm mourning the loss of.
Right. I think a lot of parents with young kids don't want their kids to, grow up Christian nationalists. But there's another issue I think is even bigger or looms even larger. And that is many young parents don't want to send their kids to a church that's not queer affirming, because they know either their family members or their friends or somebody they know is queer. They're fine with that. They think God's fine with that. And they don't want their kids to go become homophobic by going to the little Sunday school down the street. And I think that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah. I would agree with you on that. For me, that was one of the big stepping stones, I guess, when I stepped away from the church, was the church's inability to acknowledge my LGBTQIA plus siblings. But on top of that, just creating an unsafe environment, right?
Yeah. And I think there's also a change, at least in American culture, when it comes to entertainment. I think we need to be honest. I think churches are partially in the entertainment business. I don't want to go to a church that's boring. I'll just put it on the table. I mean, I want it to be more than entertainment. I'm not saying it's only entertainment or even that's the most important, but I think it is an important element. I want to be interested. I want it to be an experience that has something to it. And in our contemporary culture, there are a lot of other ways to get that kind of experience that doesn't involve going to a little church on a Sunday morning. And I think the church hasn't dealt with that well. I'm not saying I have the answer to it either. It's difficult.
No. I mean,
but
that was a place of tension for us, though, too, because I was a worship leader, and for years and years and years, that's what I did. 20 plus years, I did that, and that was always a place of tension. Which, because for us, having something that was contemporary, entertaining, and engaging was the on ramp, is the terminology we would use. That's the on ramp, to get people in the door, and then. And then you obviously have to have at least an engaging, somewhat dynamic speaker. And it used to, so for a long time when that was sort of the milieu in which I worked, I would go to a, more traditional whatever. And how do they do this every week? I mean, like, come to our place. We got a rock concert, man. We got to, And now I see, like, there's a lot of bankruptcy in that as well.
Sure.
I mean, not that those two things can't coexist, but I think we modeled ourselves a lot after churches like Hillsong. And then you find out these places have fostered these environments of all kinds of ugly stuff behind the scenes that they've painted over with pretty music and, good looking people on stage and this sort of engaging process. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, there's a lot of power struggle going on. There's a lot of abuse being, sort of swept under the carpet. And so I don't know. I think it's going to take a long time before people get back to a place where the church as an institution is something that they feel they can place their trust in.
Yeah, I do too.
I think a lot of that goodwill has been squandered. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, let me throw out, I said I don't have an answer to this, but let me throw out a proposal where I could see things going in the future. I don't know the future. I don't even think God knows the future, but this is where I think things might go. I think people want transformative, powerful, dramatic experiences, and they can't usually get them in a local church like they used to. It used to be the local church had the best entertainment in town, and now it's way down the list. However, sometimes people can go for short periods of time, a concert, a retreat, a conference, a weekend experience that is like off the charts for them. They're, like church camp when I was a kid experience. I got saved at church camp every summer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes 2 or 3 times.
I can imagine a future of religion in America in which people come together in really small groups, beer discussions, theology beer discussions, or, something around a mom's club or whatever. These very small groups, their aim isn't to have a sermon and sing songs, but this is their kind of a community of faith. And then periodically, once, twice a year, once every other year, go to this weekend or week-long conference that like rocks their world. Now, there's some downsides to this. I'm not saying this is the ideal, but I can see this becoming a model.
I can see that. I mean, that was my experience when I was involved with things like, I'm not sure if you know what a walk to Emmaus is.
Sure, yeah, I'm into that.
So when I went on my pilgrim walk, and it was transformative. It really was. It was a big deal. And I had been in the church. I was in my 30s or maybe even early 40s when I went, and not expecting to have that kind of an experience. And then there was that temptation. And they are always like, hey, listen, this can't be your church. Like, you got to go back and take this fire back to your local church, And they were big proponents of like, this can't become. But I see that though. I'm like, I could do that once a month, and maybe once a month gather with those people, and then like once a year maybe gather and hang out for a week and really kind of get.
Well, the other thing that I think is missing is just authenticity. I think, especially younger people, they are really quick to smell out the bullshit. And I think a lot of these churches, because they hide behind the glamour and the rock star look and all that they lose connection with a lot of people because there's nothing authentic there. There's no engagement. And I think that's what's missing. I think And I think something like what you're talking about would be more authentic,
Yeah.
would be more engaging.
They'd get the authenticity in the small group,
Right.
and then the we'll call it the Coachella church experience. You know, you go out there for a week in the desert, and you have this amazing thing. Yeah,
we all take ayahuasca together and have like a Burning Man thing go on.
There you go. Yeah,
Aaron Rodgers is our keynote speaker.
Even a lot of those things that they used to have, I don't know if they still make them happen today, like the Spirit West Coast and those sorts of
we're like
big,
acquire the fire.
Yeah, evangelical gatherings of youth and old and everybody. I mean, those things can be powerful, but oftentimes they are built on that same facade of inauthenticity where people are like showing up with their best face forward and no one can really talk about the nitty-gritty parts of life. And so I love what you're saying about like these sorts of, facilitating weekly retreat, or not weekly, but like monthly retreats or something where there's like a spiritual element where people get to know each other. They get to go into life together, but there's not the expectation of a formal church gathering. Because a lot of people can't go back to those sorts of spaces. There's so much pain and hurt and mistrust. And, no one can go back to those places a lot of times. So I love that idea. That's awesome.
I do. I mean, I'm in that boat. I walked into a church once a couple of years ago. You're same. It's like walking to one every week, and you're like, I am triggered weekly. I did that.
Oof, it's hard.
I did that conference with Keith Giles and all those guys in Nashville a couple of years ago, and we did it out of this little church, and a neat church, a great church. But it was, it looked like a church, and I walking in there was like, oh shit, I don't know, man. And even the pastor of that church, super nice guy. But it's amazing how even just the patterns of the way people talk when they're in the church, you know what I mean? Yeah. Even if they're they could be the most, this guy was a very queer affirming, very progressive, super nice guy. And all the affectations were still there. It still made me go, like, I don't know, you're saying the right words, but I'm not feeling it, bro. So for some people, go ahead.
Well, when we're talking about authenticity, one of the other, the number one issue that we heard over and over looking at the surveys of people who are going through deconstruction was this moving away from wanting to be associated with people or churches that had the answers, that were absolutely certain about things, that, they had this sure foundation and we had these set of beliefs that we're going to proclaim to the world because we know they're true because they're from an inerrant Bible and all that sort of stuff. And what I think is kind of odd, maybe because I'm a theologian and I don't, and I'm odd, but is that a number of people who are no longer in a faith tradition and aren't quite sure about God, they don't call themselves religious because they think religious people have to be certain about God. I was just listening to an interview with Taylor Tomlinson on Fresh Air, and she says, well, I'm not really religious because I don't really know if I believe in God. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I believe in God in the sense of being certain there's a God. Now, I'm making a claim. I'm living my life as if there is a God of love. But if certainty is the litmus test, then I'm certainly not certain about God. And I think that has to change if we're going to make some headway in dealing with people.
For me, I mean, I keep saying, I don't really know what the first domino to fall in my deconstruction was. And looking back, I can go, well, these were usually, I don't say that anymore. I find I can figure out where the places of tension were. Okay, well, this was a problem. This was a problem. And then I read Pete Enns' book, The Sin of Certainty, and it was like, yeah, you nailed it.
Oh, yeah, it's a good book.
And then I found out that, and then from that point on, what bristles me more, and this doesn't even have to be in religious spaces. It can be in any space where somebody is just obnoxiously certain of something. Unless you're talking math or logic, you don't know shit and you can't prove it. And so we're all making our best guesses at a lot of this stuff. And so that place of needing to know, and wiping out any need for curiosity or the ability to be humble and say, listen, I think this, but I could be wrong and I'm willing to learn. And the smartest people that I know are people who don't only accept criticism, but they're people who welcome it. Like, listen, if I'm wrong, I want to know. I want to believe, as one of my atheist friends says, I want to believe as many true things as possible. that's the reason he doesn't believe in God. He's like, listen, I'm not anti-God, but I don't have enough evidence to say that I believe, and I don't want to believe false things. So I want to believe as many true things as possible. I'm like, that's very smart. But I love that approach of saying, listen, I think I have an opinion, but I'm not certain, and I'm open to learning more information. And if something comes along that challenges that, I'll happily change my mind about that. But I don't see that you have that luxury as an evangelical, especially pastor. Like, people don't expect you to be squishy in those places. Like their expectation of you, I fell into this as a pastor, was like, well, you're supposed to know stuff. And I'm like, I know less every day. Was that your experience too? I mean, have you had that kind of run-in with that certainty thing?
Yeah, I remember being in seminary, and we had a professor who said that the reason conservative churches grow is because their pastors have a firm foundation and they preach out of conviction of knowing the truth. And the liberals, the reason that they're fading is because they waffle. They're not sure of things. And there may have been some truth to that. I mean, I think there are. I think that American politics tells us there are a certain amount of people who want someone who's just so sure that he's got all the answers. But I think there's a growing number of younger people who are much more attracted to someone with humility who says, I don't know. Even the most important things in life, like whether there's a God, I'm not certain. I think there's lots of people who are attracted to that now.
Well, I think that's why churches have such a hard time when somebody falls, like a pastor falls, because we've placed our faith and our trust in our pastors instead of in ourselves in some ways and the things that we've learned along the way. I just preached a sermon yesterday on unity, and this might get me into a little bit of trouble here, but at my church, we just, even though I am a United Methodist pastor and they've made all the rules for me, so it's just like I can just sit back and relax and do whatever it is that they've told me to do. But in my non-denominational church, we don't have those same structures. And so when it comes to making decisions, even on human sexuality, we as a church have never drawn the line in the sand with it. And it does, we have staff members who are queer. Maybe there is a line. I don't even know. But what we have determined is that so much of this world demands us to choose a side, to know where somebody falls. And that way we can define each other. We can put each other into these boxes and know how to deal with each other. And so, okay, so you're going to vote for Trump. I know who you are. You're going to vote for Harris. I know who you are. You're pro-life. I know who you are. And it's just one of those things where if you aren't willing to live in the tension and be curious about each other, it's like we have to know so much more about a person before we ever get to that subject line that we are saying who they are. And it was a hard message yesterday. People were like, okay, so this church isn't going to take a side here, but yet everyone, like, the certainty we have as a church is a certainty of love and acceptance and belonging. That's where the line is drawn. You are loved, you are accepted, you are needed here in your full capacity.
I mean, I think that's an ancient message that still has great appeal. It's my central message. For me, believing in God and trying to live like Jesus is centered around the issues of love and the way I do my theology, etc. And I'm happy to report that lots and lots of people are attracted to that love stuff. I think it's the most important stuff. And what's weird is that often the people who are most attracted to it are the least religious, in scare quotes. They're least has the least amount of religious language, which is kind of strange, given that at least Christianity is supposed to be oriented around a guy who exhibited amazing love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When I was curious about your whole process of how you even started deconstructing in the first place, like, was there kind of that point in your ministry? Was it in seminary? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I kind of went through two deconstructions. The first one was at the end of my college career. I took a course in philosophy of religion. Prior to that course, I was the Campus Crusade guy who walked around campus with the 4 spiritual laws, went into the local bars and started up conversations about Jesus, literally went door to door in every house in the neighborhood around the college, asking people if they knew about Jesus. I was one of those weirdos. And then I took this course in philosophy of religion, and for the first time, read some really smart atheists, agnostics, people from other religious traditions. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, I had to say, I don't have good grounds to believe that there's a God at all. In fact, I remember coming to pick up my fiancée, who's now my wife, her getting in the car and me looking at her and saying, I just can't believe in God anymore. I eventually came back to belief in God, and by belief, I mean I think it's plausible that there is a God, but I'm not certain about that. And my plausibility structures were based on 2 things, at least initially. One, I wanted life to have ultimate meaning, and I didn't think that was possible unless there was a ground of meaning that most people call God. And secondly, I thought that I ought to be a loving person and that other people ought to love, and that in some sense, love was the answer. And that didn't make good sense to me if there wasn't something like a lover, capital L lover. And I slowly started building on those 2 kind of assumptions, which meant I was probably much freer than most people to throw out a lot of the theology I've been given because I was starting from scratch again. You're a pastor. I was a pastor for 10 years, a full-time pastor. I remember going to interview for a job as a youth pastor, and the head pastor asked me about my Christology. And this was just like 6 months after I'd gone, I was an atheist. And I said, well, I think Jesus is pretty cool and God's a God of love. And that's about all I got for you. And I did not get that job.
I know you were probably shocked by that. Like, how
right.
dare?
And then the second deconstruction I went to was when I was doing my doctoral work, and it was more technical. It was around the work of Jacques Derrida and the loss of certainty in language. That's a little more boring. I won't go into detail there, but that pushed me to think that experience is more foundational than language. And that's a lot of what we talk about in God After Deconstruction, that we need to listen to our experiences, not that they're infallible, but we can learn from experience.
Well, isn't that something too that, I mean, and I've never done a deep dive on Derrida, but I know enough to be dangerous. But that was, to me, that was one of those central things, is that language it's one of the least precise things we have. I mean, it's so potentially dangerous. It's so potentially, so that's the whole point of deconstruction, as I understand it from his point of view, was identifying and trying to subvert and undermine hierarchical structures that creep into our language. And then, so there was, I think I wrote something in one of the chapters of my book about this idea of these oppositional binaries that we create, oftentimes unintentionally, because we set one thing up as this, and then the other thing automatically becomes subordinate to that thing, whether we intended that or not. And so there's this constant tension between with language and how it evolves. Anyway, so that brings me to another central problem a problem that became central for me was, what do I do with the Bible? Because when you stand in a pulpit as a preacher, and I used to hate this question. I would get these emails or something like that. I was going to come visit your church, but do you preach the word? Do you preach from the word?
Yeah.
And I'm like, so I got snippy. Yeah, I started getting snippy, and I give my best Brad, I do my best Brad Jersek impersonation. It's like, yes, we believe in the word. And he was, when he was 18 years old, however he put it, the word is imperfect and infallible. And when he was about 18 years old, he grew a beard. For us, the word of God is Jesus. But what do we do with I'm trying to word this in a way that doesn't sound dumb, but so much of our current sort of modern version of Christianity is predicated on, well, the word says this, therefore it's this. And we've pushed the experiential out. We've pushed because we have this, the foundation of the written word. Never mind that it can be interpreted in many different ways, but is that one of the dangers that creeps in that starts to cause problems for us?
Yeah. My advice to people who are deconstructing or when it comes to scripture is it all depends on who you are and where you're at. Some people should just stop reading the Bible. They should put the Bible out of their lives because it's become toxic for them. And they can't read the Bible without conjuring up all these negative things about their pastor or their youth pastor or some, experience at camp or whatever. And they need to trust the long-standing notion, not only in Christianity, but in other religious traditions, that God can speak in many other ways than a book. And it's okay not to read the Bible. If it's a trigger for you, don't read it. Other people need to take the approach of trying to read scripture through the words of Jesus, although that's not a foolproof notion either, but have a Christocentric kind of approach. I say that's not foolproof either because we all also have to interpret what Jesus says, and we're going to have lots of interpretations. So that's not inerrant either. I think there's good reasons to come to the Bible for some of us to argue with it, to point out aspects that we disagree with. I do this on a regular basis in my home church. I like to, when we read a passage of scripture, saying, I don't believe verse 16. And I say, why? Because I can't believe it and also believe something else about a God of love or whatever. So we can argue with it. We can call it wrong. We can do lots of things. It can still be a source of wisdom for me and for many others without it being infallible, inerrant, and the quote word of God, like as you mentioned earlier, that kind of word of God.
It gets problematic, and then I like that idea. I know John, that was sort of the impetus for some of your deconstruction was like, you know what, you gave up Bible for Lent. And never went back. This Lent thing's gone on for about 6 years now.
The most faithful during Lent you've ever been.
Right. I never gave up chocolate for Lent and never went back to it. No,
and also that was the beginning of the book I wrote, because I wanted to write a book where, my main character had a conversation with God without any holy, in quotes again, holy scriptures. And that was a year-long process of me having a conversation with God and just asking questions and listening for an answer. And then that became the book that I wrote. So, yeah, I guess I am one of those people who, for now, and I think we all need to understand that we are in a place right now that might be different 5 years from now or different.
Yes.
But for now, the Bible doesn't hold much weight for me. Doesn't mean that I think it's not a worthy book and that it's helpful for other people. But for me, yeah, at this point in my life, it doesn't hold much weight and it doesn't hold much hope for me, actually.
Yep. Just a minor point on that, because I've been thinking about this today. So I just want to throw it on here and see what you guys think of this idea. I've kind of grown dissatisfied with the label done. The nuns and the duns. The nuns have no religious affiliation. The duns are people who are done with religion. I think that is far too solidified. I don't think anyone really knows where they're going to go in the future. They might be done with church right now, but who knows in the future? Just like some of us who are in church right now might not be in the future. So, yeah, I don't like that done category. Yeah. I think it just doesn't fit reality.
I love that picture.
Yeah, there's a sense of finality to that sort of belies all of our trajectories, right? It's like we're all moving, I hope. The point of deconstruction for me was never to, deconstruct everything down and be done with it. It also wasn't necessarily go rebuild it. I honestly didn't know what came next. And that's actually been part of the joy of it, is discovering what's next.
Well, I'm sure we've all been on the side of the question. So what are you going to do when your deconstruction is over?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
when's that going to be?
Yeah. And for me, I'm at a point right now. It's like, I don't know if it's ever going to end.
That's fun, though. It's fun to know that it's not going to end. I think it is. I think it's full of hope. It's full of just open-ended possibilities. It's like the idea of thinking of God through the process theologian lens, where you're like, well, there's this unending possibility of God and me and this world, and who knows what the future holds. And I don't think God necessarily knows what the future holds, because God gets to respond to us as we respond to everything else. And I don't know. It's exciting to me.
Can I emphasize that a little bit, Bethany? Because I'm guessing some of your listeners may not have heard of process theology or open and relational theology. This idea that we're always moving and there's a future of possibilities, that the future isn't settled. Open and relational and process thinkers think that not only applies to us and creation, but also applies to God. That God not only doesn't predetermine the future, but doesn't even foreknow it exhaustively. In other words, God's not absolutely certain who's going to win the next U.S. presidential election, because that's not something anyone can know with certainty, because it hasn't yet happened. And so this notion of a dynamic God and a dynamic universe relating with dynamic creatures like you and me, that's at the heart of the open and relational vision that Tripp Fuller and I offer in this book, God After Deconstruction.
And that's such a departure, and in a refreshing way, by the way. So such a departure, because the other book that you wrote, or one of the other books you wrote, was The Death of Omnipotence. And so there is this process, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, but you have step by step by step. In some ways, you've demystified God. Like, you've taken some of these big words away that actually make God somewhat unapproachable. Well, if God is omniscient or omnipotent, whatever that, and I sat in church and sang about God Almighty, and this idea that God knows everything leads you to that not just the predestination, but that predetermination, where it almost doesn't matter what you do, you were going to walk this path anyway. There's a bit of nihilism, I think, built into that kind of thinking. It's a hopelessness for me if you take it to its extremes. Why bother? Why pray? Why work? Why? I used to wonder why Calvinists even sent out missionaries, because God was going to save who God was going to save. What were you adding to the conversation? But I love that for me is the attraction for open and relational theology. The idea that the future is not set, and not just for us. That God Himself doesn't necessarily know. I think we talked about this maybe one or two podcasts ago, where we wondered aloud if maybe God had like the computer kind of brain that could maybe know all the possible permutations of this. Like, hey, maybe God could give you like every possible outcome, but which way humanity will go, what's the point of telling us we have choices to make if He knows the outcome? So,
well, and that brings up another point of deconstruction, right? This idea that if God knows everything and God chooses to not intervene in our pain, then why the hell should I follow this God, right? So it's another one of those linchpins that gets pulled, and it's like I can't follow this God, right?
But even within that, it's like you could still be to that place of saying, I don't know if God knows everything, every little detail, or if God's responding as we go. Like, I don't know. All I know is that there's something about this divine love that is so compelling that I can't help but just continue forth in it, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, that's where I'm at, Bethany. Yeah. And I think there's another aspect of this that is often overlooked that I want to emphasize, and that is that if, in fact, we are moving through time into an open, yet to be determined future that God hasn't predetermined and hasn't foreknown, God's along with that journey through time, that means that our decisions, our choices, our lives actually make history and really matter. We're significant. We not only have value, but our choices make a real difference. And that, to me, means that our lives can have real meaning. If, in fact, everything was pre-programmed, it seems to me we would have a hard time thinking our choices matter and then doubt that our lives would matter. But in this scheme, life really does matter.
Well, and that's that nihilism I was talking about there, right? Because so much of my evangelical upbringing was the fact that, well, it doesn't really matter what you do because God's already, I've read the back of the book, we win. Don't worry about taking care of planet Earth. It's all going to burn. We're going to get a new one anyway. There was all this sort of just laissez-faire attitude towards everything because we weren't really responsible for the end of it. God was going to take care of everything. God was going to come along, wipe away every tear, fix every problem, and wipe away all of our enemies. And there's not a lot. I don't know. For me, it got to a point where that was just sort of, it was hopelessness in that. You know?
Yeah. And the answer to the kid who raised the hand and said, yeah, but that doesn't make sense. The answer was, you just need to obey. You know, I sang a song in Sunday school,
yes.
Trust and obey, because there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. And as part of that trust and obey is kind of a, put your brain aside for a while. Have faith that this is the way things are, who God is. And that approach not only takes out the intellectual element of our faith, but sets a lot of people up to be victims of religious leaders who are telling you, don't use your brain, listen to me. Let me call the shots.
Yeah.
Just trust and obey me because I am God's person. And so there's all kinds of negative side effects to that approach to things.
Yeah, totally. That trust and obey was always pointed towards the leaders. Even though he's saying it's no one can be happy except in Jesus, it was always the guy with the tie who was saying you need to obey.
Right.
How come it was always a guy with a tie too? What the hell, man?
I know.
And by the way, just so you know, I'm singing the song in my head, and
we all are.
I'm not happy about it. That's bringing up a little bit of church trauma for me.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right, man. That's good. I mean, but it's such an important point, and we talk about this. Actually, what's really strange, Tom, is that this mirrors the conversations I've been listening to with other people. It mirrors the conversations I'm even having with atheists who are saying, like, listen, you think that because I don't believe in God that I don't have this and I don't have this and I don't have a moral compass. I haven't found meaning in life. And they're like, actually, I think I have more meaning than a lot of you, certain Christians do, because I don't know how this all plays out. And almost exactly what you just said is what they would say to me is like, every decision I make actually has an impact. It matters. And I'm learning. So I'm like, I think we can learn a lot. And that's been my commitment this year. And I don't know if it was I'm not sure if I ever sat down and consciously decided to do this, but for my entire life as a Christian, we were not to pay attention to atheists. We certainly weren't supposed to read their books, and we were supposed to deride them as fools and celebrate them on April 1st. And they were just silly people, Yeah. And now I'm like, some of the most thoughtful people I know, and even some of the most thoughtful theologians I know have either gone through a period of dabbling with atheism, or even on the other side of it have become very, very agnostic in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like, listen, I think for me, that's one of the most authentic places I can be. And agnosticism means I just can't know for sure. And to me, that's the heart of faith anyway. If I'm standing in a pulpit, I'm certain of everything. I don't have faith in anything. I have knowledge somehow.
Yeah, I'd agree. The most authentic connection I've had with God is when I decided that, I'm an agnostic when it comes to my belief if God exists or not. I don't think, I think like you, Tom, said, it's not something that can be proved. But but if there is a God, there's going to be, the God's going to be a God of love.
Right.
And that's like the starting point for me.
Me too.
And if it turns out he's not, then screw him anyway.
Well, it's almost like if you think you only have three choices. Choice number one, you're certain there is no God. Choice number two, you don't know, so you're an agnostic. Or choice number three, you're certain there is a God. I'm an agnostic if those are the only three choices I've got. Now,
yeah,
I think most people ought to be agnostics. I think Jesus was an agnostic. So if those are the only three options, that middle way seems the best way. Now, I'm not sure the word agnostic is the best word to use to describe that, the position I'm in. But if those are my three options, that's the one I would choose.
And like everything else, that word can carry baggage with it. I'm sure for some folks have certain connotations. I mean it in the best possible way. I mean it in a very positive way. And actually, most of the people I've interacted with recently who are atheists would actually, they will tell you, well, I fall more on the, I'm not certain of this. I fall more on that agnostic side. I'm an agnostic atheist. God's going to have to do a lot to prove it to me, but if he's God, then he should know what it would take to change my mind about this. And I'm open to that discussion. But those conversations are worthwhile though for me, because it causes us to be curious. That was my favorite line. There's a clip of the movie Ted Lasso, of the show Ted Lasso, that runs around where I don't know if you've seen, first of all, best show ever. Love that show. But he's in a bar and he's shooting darts and he's betting this guy and he's playing darts. And the little speech he gives at the end is about, basically, like I was always taught to be curious, and you've never once been curious. You've just been either criticized or judged, however he put it. But essentially he's like, you've never been curious about, like, did I play a lot of darts as a kid? And he's like, oh, yes, I did. As a matter of fact, did I spend every weekend in a pub with my dad? Well, yes, actually I did that too. But there's that celebration of curiosity that says, listen, there's more here to know than any one of us could ever know. Wouldn't it be better to approach all of this with that level of optimism, that level of curiosity that says, I'm open to knowing more about this? And wouldn't that help us in the climate we're in, especially when it comes to whether or not churches will be queer affirming, whether or not they're going to be open to an entire segment of people that, first of all, you're missing out on amazing human beings. You should have them in your church. But is that part of that calculation of asking the church to kind of open up their heart a little bit and maybe reassess some of their theology? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Bethany, were you going to jump in there?
It was actually kind of a similar question. I was curious about when you were a pastor, or when you were pastoring a church, did you have a congregation that was supportive of deconstruction or supportive of queer affirming theology? And what was that experience like for you? Because I know you've been through a lot in the last few months as well.
Yeah. This has been a rough summer.
Yeah.
Just so your listeners know, in the end of July of 2024, I went through an official church trial because I'm a queer affirming ordained elder. And at that trial, they not only took away my ordination or my credentials, they also removed my membership. So I'm no longer a membership in the Church of the Nazarene, where I've been a member since my teenage years. I happen to attend a church that is affirming. We have to be, the leadership has to be more quiet about that, which is unfortunate, but because of their link to the Church of the Nazarene. So I have lots of support from my local church for my views. But, my growing up years was in a little town in eastern Washington state, and I had an extraordinary pastor who was, I don't think he was, at least he never told me he was queer affirming, but he was always, like Nat was saying, he was a curious person, and he was a wise person. And so that helped me to sort of think through the issues related to queer matters back in the early 1990s. Now, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Bethany, but I guess you asked me, do I have support? Yeah, I do in my local church, but obviously at least some of the major leaders in the denomination were not in support of my queer affirmation.
Well, we all watched that go down, and but that wasn't your first trial, right?
No, it was my third trial. My first one was in 2015, and that was over more theological matters, and I was not deemed a heretic. And then in 2022, the early part of 2022, I did have a trial that was partly theology and partly on the queer issues. The theology stuff was really weak, and I didn't get convicted on that. But on the queer stuff, I came out and said, the church is wrong. It needs to change. It needs to be affirming. And I wasn't disciplined by those, the group that heard my case did not recommend I be disciplined. My district superintendent ended up taking away my assignment anyway, and he was the one who eventually gave me charges and had the third trial. So, yeah, I've been through a few of these.
First of all, I'm sorry for that. Like I said, we all kind of got to watch from the outside looking in going, ooh, I think there are a lot of people probably listening to this podcast, probably a lot of people in America who who would be unaware that things like heresy trials exist.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, what the hell, man? Is this like Reformation era, church discipline? Thankfully, they don't end the way they used to end.
Yeah, that's right.
We might not be having this conversation.
Yeah.
Well, old Tom, he had a good run. We miss him. But it could have been worse.
Yeah.
But there is a. I have always, I've respected you from the get-go for your for your willingness to stick your neck out, and a lot of us are willing to stick our necks out up until the point where it's going to cost us. And you've obviously taken the risk, knowing full well what it might cost you. I've also respected the fact that you fought like hell to stay inside of your denomination, and work from the inside. I think in other denominations, I've seen that play out. I've watched what's happened with the Methodist Church, and I think that has to be at least some of the calculation that the Church of the Nazarene is worried about. Like, this could split our denomination down the middle, and are we willing to take that risk? Now, I applaud the Methodist Church for saying, "All right, so be it. If that's the way it goes, that's the way it goes." I know it wasn't easy. I know it's been a painful split, but I don't know, man. It's there are people, I'll say this without equivocation, there are people who will be alive down the road who might not otherwise have been because of people like you. And that's really where it comes, like where the rubber meets the road for me is all that.
Yeah, I want to be clear. I mean, I don't expect everyone to do what I did. Like, some people, they need to walk away from a church rather than go through the trials kind of stuff that I did, just because of who they are, where they're at. So I don't want to raise my case up as, everybody needs to follow what Tom did. But I felt like I was at a place in my life, and I had a platform that I had the a streak of orneriness in me that was going to fight.
Yeah.
And, a certain status as a theologian, that this was a way I could maybe make a difference in some way. So just to repeat, I don't think everybody needs to do what I did. The situation just happened to work out. I mean, another factor, I've got a very supportive partner. My wife is, she's not perfect. No partners are perfect, but she was willing to say, yes, go for this, do this. And that means a lot, because it takes a lot out of her, took a lot out of my kids and friends. And so to have a support network, not everybody has that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. No, and I think that's an important point to make, that not everyone has those. Obviously, everyone's circumstances are different. And so if you don't feel like you can stay, you don't yet go. And for some, at the very beginning, we're responsible to protect ourselves. And I've known people who've had to walk away from church just for their own mental health, sometimes for their own physical health.
Yeah, that's right. It took a toll on me, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that.
You say my hair is gray? Is that what you're saying?
I can't see you're wearing that. You're wearing that.
That's right.
I make no hair jokes. I have no grounds to criticize. I'm holding on to the little tufts I still have in the back of my head. But
well, I'm curious, Tom, like, what have you been able to do that has brought you peace over the last couple of months? Like, what has been filling your soul, and what does taking care of yourself look like?
I have a few practices that have been really helpful. I'll mention two in particular. One, I get out and hike in nature a lot and make photographs, and I hike by myself. So those times away from everything in the natural world are very good for me to meditate, to pray, to just sort of detox. And so that's a really big practice for me. I go out at least once a week all by myself. And I live in Idaho, so we got empty spaces out here. Another practice that I've been doing for quite some time is a kind of breathing prayer, where I symbolically breathe in God and then breathe out love. And that way of thinking helps me to center myself. I was struggling with breathing problems because of anxiety this summer coming up to this trial, and so I'm sure that breathing helped me physiologically as well as mentally. So those two things have been, really important. Maybe I'll just add one more. I didn't isolate myself entirely. I also found folks who could be friends with me and support me, and whether that's the people in my local church or friends from college or some of my doctoral students. So I had that kind of a network. And as since you're a Methodist, Bethany, John Wesley talked about the importance of conferencing. So I was conferencing a lot.
It's such a removed term,
Yeah.
but I do understand it.
Isn't there a hymn about conferencing together? Come, let us conference together. No, probably not. I think you could write a new Wesleyan hymn. It would be great. I would like to conference with some folks right about now.
I tell you what I was most worried about, Bethany. So just to let you and some of your, and whoever's listening to this know, I took a very aggressive approach to this trial. They gave me the charges in the summer of 2023 and told me I would face a trial that fall. And I immediately began to work on my defense. And for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, the church decided not to do the trial until the next summer. So I had my lengthy defense written. And I said to myself, okay, this is going to be an opportunity. My trial will be an opportunity to say some things in the public sphere. I'm going to be aggressive in that. And so I published my defense before the trial even occurred. I put it out into the world so everyone could see what I was going to say. I hired media people in Nashville and New York to help me with the national media. I hired someone locally. I hired a videographer to come in and film me doing clips of things as to put on social media. I was in constant interaction with a Facebook group called Loving Nazarenes. So I saw my trial. I was confident I was going to lose at least my credentials at the trial. So I knew I wasn't playing to sort of win the trial. What I was playing for is to make a case for the public for why Christians ought to be fully affirming, or in my case, the Church of the Nazarene ought to be fully affirming. And so because of that, the stakes were even higher in one sense because the critics were much stronger on social media calling me names and things. But I felt like I had like a mission and a purpose. And so when it came to the trial itself, the one thing I was praying most that I would be able to do is to keep control of my emotions. I wanted to be a loving person who was making the arguments of love at the trial. And so that was what I was most anxious at. I didn't want to get to the trial and fly off the handle, and do something I regret. And fortunately, that didn't happen. I feel good about the way I acted. My wife was there with me, and she was helpful, and she felt good about it. So I don't know where I was going with that comment, except I know. I was just saying the argument, my main concern leading up like the month before was, okay, Tom, when you're in that trial, be loving like Jesus would be loving. That doesn't mean acquiesce, be passive. I was aggressive in my arguments. I called out crappy arguments and, in the middle of things, but I was going to be a person who was kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I'm sure that was such a witness to people, and the affirmation of kindness and the affirmation of peace, even while you were declaring the truths that needed to go out.
I had jurors who voted me guilty come up to me during the breaks and thank me for my attitude. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. There's so much pain all over that. Not just the pain that you experienced, the pain that the jurors experienced, having to be faithful to what they thought was important, and then also seeing what they probably thought was more important, and they weren't able to go forward with that. So it's very brave.
Well, as always, man, it is always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for giving us your time. All of Tom's books are available, by the way. You should, if you don't have the complete library, I don't know what you're even doing with your life.
The complete library, I love it.
At this point, there's at least 4, 5, 6. I don't know. There's enough to keep you busy. I don't even know what order you should read. I feel like I'm talking about Tolkien. What order should we read Lord of the Rings? But I will say this: if you've made it this far and you're still listening, if you want something that will break your brain in the best possible way, I would start with God Can't, because I think it starts to peel back. And like I said, if this is not systematic, at least if it was unintentionally systematic, well done. But I feel like every book you write peels back another layer of some of these barriers we've put up between ourselves and God, and some of these things that we have used to make God somewhat unapproachable. So God Can't broke my brain in a really good way. Uncontrolling Love of God, obviously, Death of Omnipotence, and then this new book, God After Deconstruction. I just downloaded your defense, so I'm going to read that here pretty soon too. There are so many places that being open about our theology and being willing to listen to others can take us into so many places that are beautiful. That's what keeps me hanging on, Tom. So no, not to put too much responsibility on, but you're no, I'm just kidding. But it does give me hope that things are moving, at least in some sectors, in a good direction, and that there are places to go that are still beautiful, that are still full of wonder and mystery and all kinds of awesome stuff. So for that, I thank you, man.
Yeah.
Any other parting words, John?
Nope, you've said it all, man.
No, I just stop it. Yeah, I know. What you mean to say is, Jesus, stop talking so much. I know.
I like that.
I can't help it.
I like that you suggested people start with God Can't, because I could recommend the book that I wrote called Open and Relational Theology, and that kind of eases people into it, like the ideas. But there's something about starting with God Can't that, as you said, it just hits you right over the head. God can't stop evil. And that's like, for a lot of people... Oh, go ahead.
Well, if you can't get past that, I don't think you'll get the rest of it. It's not going to make much sense. But I remember telling you, we interviewed you about that book, and I told you, I'm like, yeah, I think I told you, I think you're just being provocative with this title. I think you're just messing with us. And I'm like, and then I read it. I'm like, no, he was serious. Son of a bitch.
It's funny you say that.
And then towards the end, I'm like, oh, actually, yeah, okay, yeah, this makes an awful lot of sense to me. And there's so much theology that I read that sort of demands of you that you like you set aside your own common sense. And you go, or it's just full of theological jargon that you have to, and don't get me wrong, I love Bart like anybody else, but I have to still run to my dictionary every other word. But there's so much of this approach that is more, it does jive more with our common sense in some ways. You go, well, of course,
it fits
this makes sense.
It makes sense. It's reasonable. A little background story on God Can't. When I had that manuscript done, I was thinking, man, maybe this book, I should get an agent and try to shop it around to a major press. So I ended up getting hold of this agent, and she was thinking, I said, would you consider this to be my agent? She said, well, I'll read the book and, get back to you. So I have the little conversation with her, and she starts the conversation just kind of doing the normal thing you get from a book agent, like, who's your audience, yada, 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 And I'm thinking, oh, well, she must not like this book. And then she says, in the first chapter, you tell the reader that they should be prepared to something like have their mind blown or something like that. And she said, I read that and I thought to myself, how many times have I read a book that says that and that it never delivers? She said, your book delivers.
Nice. That needs to be the quote when you do when you inevitably put this out for reprint for the however many pressings you do. That'll be this book delivers, and cite her as a quote in the back. It's not my favorite quote. I do think that who was it? Oh, Douglas Campbell. But on the back of the book, he has a quote from N.T. Wright, who essentially says like I don't agree with much of this book, but it's well written or thoroughly researched. And I asked Doug, I'm like you had to put that on the back? He's like, it's a great quote. Of course I put it on the back.
That's awesome.
Well, thanks for the conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you. And good to meet you, Bethany.
Nice to meet you.
You bring
too,
a
Tom.
good balance
Thank
to
you.
these two guys.
Yeah, we need it. Yeah, we do actually. She youths us up a bunch too because she's only like 25. So
There you go.
I'm 45, but close. Very close.
45 is a new 25. What do we know? All right, brother. Hey, thank you so much, man. I hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd love to do that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.